No one thought a forest could kill an army, but in the autumn of 1944, the Herken Forest, an endless maze of pine and fog, decided to fight back. The men who entered it didn't find a battlefield. They found something alive, something patient. It whispered through the branches, marked every step, and waited. For weeks, American soldiers clawed their way through the mud, convinced they were fighting Germans. But what they were really fighting was the earth itself, a living labyrinth that swallowed men whole. Artillery turned trees into shrapnel. Fire rained from leaves. Every breath carried the scent of pine and death. By the time the forest went silent again, over 33,000 men were gone, and no one was sure who had truly won. This is the story of the battle nature itself refused to lose. Welcome to Green Hell, the Herken Forest. If stories like this make you pause, if they remind you how fragile survival really is, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel to keep these forgotten moments of history alive, and share this video with someone who loves the hidden stories behind the wars we thought we understood. Autumn 1944. Europe was breathing again, or at least that's what everyone wanted to believe. Paris was free. Allied flags fluttered above French rooftops, and the soldiers marching eastward could almost taste Christmas. Home was just over the next ridge, they told themselves. Just one more push. But the earth had other plans. Ahead of them lay a sea of trees, tall, endless, ancient. The Herken Forest. It looked quiet. Too quiet. The mist clung to the pines like old ghosts. No movement. No birds. No sound but the crunch of boots sinking into damp soil. To most of the men, it was just another patch of woods between them and victory. But to those who'd studied the maps, who'd seen the contour lines twist like coiled serpents, it was something far worse. A natural fortress that had chewed up armies before and was about to do it again. No one realized it yet, but this wasn't going to be a battle against an enemy they could see. This was going to be a war against the earth itself. The soldiers of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division were the first to step into that green maze. They came loaded with confidence, tanks rumbling, radios buzzing, artillery primed. The Army's playbook was clear: keep moving, overwhelm, and never give the enemy time to breathe. But inside Herken, breathing was exactly what killed you. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, fog, and the smell of rotting pine needles. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Even the light looked nervous, filtering weakly through the branches. Every direction looked the same: trunks, roots, shadows. A perfect place to get lost or ambushed. Then came the first sound, a crack. Not from a gun, from above. A shell kissed a branch, and the forest exploded. Splinters sliced through the air like glass. Metal rained from the canopy. Screams echoed, then vanished into the fog. When the smoke cleared, the trees stood untouched. Only the men were gone. One survivor whispered later, "It wasn't the Germans shooting at us, it was the forest itself." The Germans had been waiting, hidden deep, patient as stone. Veterans of retreat, masters of camouflage, they had turned nature into their ally. Every path was mapped. Every clearing was zeroed in by artillery. They didn't need to see the Americans. They only needed to hear them. The clank of a rifle, the crack of a branch. Then came the whistle. And death followed. Each explosion wasn't random. It was measured, scientific, precise. The shells didn't land on the ground. They burst above it. They called it a tree burst. The blast shredded everything beneath, sending thousands of wooden daggers downward. For the Americans, cover was a lie. Hiding under trees meant dying faster. Digging in meant waiting for death to find you. Even the dirt betrayed them, collapsing under rain and fire. Herken was no battlefield. It was an ecosystem of pain, every element designed to destroy you slowly. You can almost picture it. mud so deep it pulled the boots off your feet, the stench of smoke and pine, the distant thump of artillery echoing like a heartbeat. The soldiers started naming the forest. Some called it the meat grinder, others the green tomb. But one name stuck, Green Hell, because that's exactly what it was. Command didn't understand. How could a forest stop an army? They ordered more troops forward, more tanks, more shells. But Herken didn't care about numbers. Airstrikes? Useless. The canopy turned the sky into a blindfold. Armor. Helpless. The Shermans choked on mud, stuck between trees too narrow for their turrets to turn. Momentum? Impossible. The forest allowed no speed, no rhythm. It forced men to crawl, not charge. It was as if the forest itself knew how to fight. One officer would later write, "Every tree had a sniper, every shadow had a trap, every breath felt borrowed." By the third week, the 9th Division had advanced less than 2 miles. 2 miles. For that progress, they'd left behind over 4,500 dead and wounded, 1 man for every yard of ground. Night in Herken was worse than battle. The darkness pressed down, thick and absolute. Men whispered to trees, begged the silence not to move. Some prayed out loud, others simply stared at the shadows until dawn broke, if it ever did. And when dawn came, it didn't bring light. It brought more artillery. The Germans didn't fight to win ground. They fought to waste time. Every hour the Americans spent in Herken was a gift to the Reich. Behind the forest, German generals were building something, a secret counteroffensive that would soon become known as the Battle of the Bulge. But for now, the soldiers didn't know that. All they knew was that the forest wouldn't let them leave. The men began to change. Their faces hollowed, their eyes turned glassy. They stopped shaving, stopped writing letters. The forest stripped them down, not just their gear, but their sanity. A medic later said, "You stopped thinking in words. You started thinking in sounds. Shells, screams, wind through branches." That was the language of Herken. It was a place where even silence had weight, where stillness didn't mean safety, it meant something was listening. And yet, there was something hauntingly beautiful about it all. In the rare moments between barrages, the mist would settle. The smoke would fade, and for just a second, the world would look peaceful again. The trees would stand tall, quiet, ancient, pretending they didn't know what they had just done. But the ground told the truth. It was soaked with blood and oil, boots half buried in mud, helmets crushed into roots, letters home floating in puddles. If you looked close enough, the forest wasn't green anymore. It was gray, black, and red. By the time the first units pulled back, there were barely enough men to carry the wounded. The rest, the ones who could still walk, didn't talk about victory. They talked about surviving another hour. One private scrawled a line in his diary before dying 2 days later. "We came to fight men, but here even the trees have teeth." That sentence would later become one of the most haunting quotes of the entire campaign. A small sentence buried in a field report, but one that captured everything the forest had done to them. Because Herken wasn't just killing soldiers, it was rewriting the rules of war. In most battles, men fought each other. In Herken, they fought an idea, the illusion that humanity could control the battlefield. Every bullet, every explosion, every scream was a reminder that nature doesn't take sides. It simply endures. And that's what made Herken so terrifying. The Germans weren't just hiding in the forest. They had become part of it. Their uniforms blended into bark. Their gunfire echoed from no direction and every direction at once. To the Americans, it was like being hunted by ghosts. The longer they stayed, the more the forest seemed to study them. It learned their movements, their timing. It punished their habits. Move too fast, and you'd walk into an ambush. Stay still, and artillery would find you. Try to hide, and the trees themselves would explode above your head. War had become something primal again, stripped of glory, reduced to survival. And in that brutal simplicity, the Herken Forest revealed its cruel genius. It didn't need to defeat an army. It only needed to erase their will to keep fighting. By October, the fog never lifted. The ground never dried. Radios failed. Maps became useless, and units got lost within shouting distance of each other. Commanders begged for daylight operations. They never came. The clouds refused to part. Even the sky seemed loyal to the enemy. Some men began to believe the forest was cursed. Others simply stopped caring. They would dig foxholes by instinct, crawl into them and wait, not for orders, not for rescue, but for the next sound, that distant whistle, that crack above the canopy, that moment when the forest decided it was time again. And yet, even in that nightmare, there was something deeply human. Men shared cigarettes with trembling hands. Medics carried wounded comrades through the rain, whispering prayers they'd long forgotten how to mean. Some soldiers tied strings between trees so they could find their way back in the fog. Others carved names into the bark, small proof that they existed, even if only for another night. Because deep down, they all knew one truth. The forest wasn't going anywhere, but they might. By the end of October, the Herken campaign had swallowed entire divisions. Command called it a local operation. History would later call it one of the most tragic miscalculations of the entire war. But in those early weeks, no one had the luxury of hindsight. All they had was mud, rain, fear, and the slow realization that they weren't just fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to get out alive. And somewhere deep in that maze of trees, the forest listened. It had already chosen its next victims. Because in Herken, silence was never peace. It was preparation. Autumn's chill had barely touched the Ardennes when the soldiers of the U.S. First Army started whispering a single phrase, "Home by Christmas." It was printed on postcards, murmured over tin cups of coffee, scribbled in the margins of letters that would never make it past the forest line. They'd stormed across France at lightning speed, leaving shattered German lines in their wake. Paris was behind them, Cologne lay ahead. How hard could a patch of forest be? To them, the Herken was just a pause before victory, a quick operation to clear a few ridges and capture a pair of dams. The maps looked harmless, a splash of green on white paper. But maps lie. The veterans of Normandy could smell trouble before it spoke. The newcomers, young and eager, could not. They still carried photographs of sweethearts in coat pockets and souvenirs from liberated towns. When they entered the woods, they were singing. Within days, the songs stopped. Rain began to fall, not the gentle drizzle of Europe's autumn, but sheets that turned roads into rivers and foxholes into graves. The men learned new rituals. Shake the mud off your rifle every hour. Keep your matches in a sock. Never sleep near a tree that looks split, because that tree might be ready to fall. By the third week of November, they were marching through a watercolor of misery, green fading into brown, brown into blood. Letters home described the same dream. Warm kitchens, mothers' voices, the sound of doors that closed against the cold. None of those dreams survived the first barrage. When artillery rained through the canopy, even memory seemed to vanish. One soldier wrote, "I forgot my own name for a minute. The noise erased it." The Americans had come believing in progress, that war was an equation of technology and courage. In Herken, neither mattered. Engineers tried to build roads, but the mud swallowed their machinery. Medics crawled through shell fire to reach the wounded, only to vanish into craters. Priests carried crosses that glowed faintly in the flash of explosions. Every mile felt like a lifetime. Still, they believed the promise. Home by Christmas. It was the one order that no officer had to give. Yet somewhere, deep under the roar of artillery, the forest whispered back, "Not this year." The first men to name the forest Green Hell weren't poets. They were engineers and riflemen who'd seen trees turn into weapons. German artillery had perfected something sinister. The tree burst. shells timed to detonate not on the ground but in the air, just as they brushed the branches. The result was murder by mathematics. Every explosion sent 1,000 wooden knives downward. The air itself became lethal. No foxhole was safe. A man could dig 6 feet deep and still be shredded by splinters raining from above. Helmets caved, lungs filled with dust and bark. Survivors learned to read the sounds, the rising whine of a shell, the split-second pause before impact. Some claimed they could feel the pressure change just before death arrived. The forest taught fast and punished slower learners. To the Germans, this was engineering perfection. They'd mapped every path, every bend in the ridge lines. Their gunners didn't guess. They calculated. Their weapon crews were scientists of destruction. They called their artillery Gott mit uns, God with us. And perhaps they believed it. The Americans, trapped under the canopy, began to feel like intruders in someone else's cathedral. The pillars were trees, the hymns were explosions, and every prayer ended with silence. One private wrote, "The trees were alive. They hissed, cracked, screamed. You couldn't shoot back at a tree." The Herken Forest had become a living machine. Roots for trenches, leaves for camouflage, branches for execution. To understand the slaughter, you have to understand the mind behind it. Field Marshal Walter Model, the defender of the Reich. Model saw terrain not as scenery, but as a blueprint. He knew the American doctrine: speed, aggression, combined arms. So he built the antidote: stillness. Every hill was measured, every trail zeroed. His map looked less like a battlefield and more like a geometric puzzle: angles, arcs, perfect firing solutions. When an American squad stepped into a clearing, they weren't exploring. They were entering coordinates. Artillery fell with mechanical precision, not in chaos but in rhythm. Each silence between salvos was deliberate, designed to trick men into moving. Then, another barrage. The Germans didn't need numbers. They had patience. Model's genius was time. The Herken wasn't meant to stop the Allies forever. It was meant to delay them long enough for Hitler's next move, a secret build-up to the West that would erupt as the Battle of the Bulge. So the forest became a clock. Every minute the Americans bled, there was another minute bought for the Reich. The U.S. command didn't realize this. They kept feeding divisions into the grinder, 9th, 28th, 4th, believing the forest could be cleared. But how do you clear something that's alive? By November, officers were whispering what no one dared put on paper. We're fighting the terrain itself. And in that admission lay the truth. The forest was winning. When doctrine dies, instinct takes over. By late November, the Americans had stopped trying to outthink the forest. They began to imitate it. Engineers, those quiet miracle workers, crawled forward with dynamite and saws, carving new paths where the roads ended. Each blast shook the ground. Each explosion was a scream of defiance. Behind them, Shermans waited like beasts in cages. They were no longer the hunters of North Africa. They were shields now, stripped down, repurposed. Some were converted into M7 priests, their guns lifted upward to fire through the canopy. Their shells tore holes in the forest's lungs. The thunder rolled back across the valleys, an echo that said, "We're still here." Improvisation became religion. Jeep crews welded rocket tubes to their roofs. Infantry learned to time movements between barrages, counting seconds like heartbeats. Medics invented new tricks, building roofs of logs over foxholes to deflect splinters. The protection was thin, but it gave hope. And in Herken, hope was armor. Each adaptation came at a cost. Every innovation was written in blood. Yet slowly, painfully, the Americans began to survive longer. The forest, once a teacher of death, had become a cruel mentor of endurance. And for the first time, it started to bleed. Orders came down like thunder. Take the village of Schmidt. It sounded simple. Just a few kilometers through the woods. But simplicity is suicide in Herken. The 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, moved out in early November. Rain fell like judgment. Visibility shrank to 10 yards. Every step was through mud that remembered the dead. Then the forest came alive again. Artillery. Always artillery. The sky ripped open with fire. Tree bursts shrieked overhead, spraying metal and bark. The men dropped flat, faces in the dirt, waiting for the next wave. Yet they moved, inch by inch. When they finally reached Schmidt, the village was already gone, pounded into dust. German counterattacks came from all sides. Communications failed. Entire companies vanished in the fog. By nightfall, the 110th Regiment no longer existed. The survivors didn't retreat. They dug in. Trenches hacked through roots. Rifles braced against fallen trunks. When the next barrage came, they answered with their own. M7 priests rolled forward, engines howling, firing at arcs that lit the forest orange. For the first time, the echo favored the Americans. But victory never came, only exhaustion. The 28th entered with 14,000 men. Barely 2,000 walked out. The rest were absorbed by the mud, the rain, and the memory of a place that refused to give them back. By December, Herken no longer felt like Earth. It felt like purgatory. The constant shelling, the rain, the sleepless nights, they broke the boundaries of sanity. Men forgot the days. They stopped counting kills or kilometers. Some spoke to trees. Some laughed when shells fell, unable to do anything else. Psychiatrists would later call it combat fatigue. In Herken, it had another name: becoming a ghost. Mail stopped coming. The few letters that arrived were stained, unreadable. Radios hissed static. The only voice that answered was the forest itself, the wind through the pines, the moan of shattered branches. A medic remembered, "We didn't think in words anymore, just sounds." The front line dissolved into something abstract, a fog of men crawling through dimensions of terror. Even in rest, there was no escape. Sleep brought dreams of the forest breathing, roots coiling around limbs, whispering names. For many, those dreams never ended. Yet amid the madness, evolution took hold. American gunners grew sharp. They listened, not to orders, but to rhythm. They learned to hear the distance in the echo, to feel the reload pauses of German batteries. Forward observers crawled closer, guiding counterfire with whispered coordinates. When their own shells screamed back through the trees, the forest shuddered. The Germans began to miss. The perfect geometry fractured. One captured sergeant admitted, "They've learned the forest." The hunters had become the hunted. It wasn't a triumph of technology, but of transformation. The Americans stopped fighting the way they were trained and started fighting the way the forest demanded. Silent, patient, merciless. By December, the Herken campaign had consumed over 120,000 American troops in rotation. Yet within that nightmare, a new kind of soldier was born. One who understood that survival was victory. The forest had tried to break them. Instead, it forged them. While Herken burned, Model's delay worked. Behind the lines, Hitler's last gamble gathered strength. On December 16, 1944, tanks roared out of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The men pulled from Herken were thrown straight into it, frostbitten, hollow-eyed, but unshakable. Nothing scared them anymore. They'd fought something worse than an army, a place that didn't bleed. When the snow fell on Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, these same veterans manned the guns. This time, they had a new weapon, proximity fuses that detonated shells in midair, tree bursts reborn, but now under Allied control. A German officer later wrote, "Their shells burst in the air as ours once did. The forest turned against us." The lesson of Herken had been absorbed, brutal and final. Patience kills faster than power. The Americans had learned it the hard way, buried beneath roots and rain. When the Bulge ended, the Germans were broken, but the victors didn't celebrate. They just sat quietly, hearing the ghosts of Herken in the crackle of winter fires. Spring came. The forest bloomed again. Grass grew over craters, moss-covered helmets. Birds returned, singing above unmarked graves. To a passerby, Herken looked healed. But the veterans knew better. When they revisited the woods years later, they walked in silence. Under their boots lay rusted dog tags, shattered rifles, bones fused to roots. One man whispered, "The forest never forgot our names. It just keeps them under the soil." Historians still debate the Herken campaign. Some call it strategic folly, others an unavoidable tragedy. But the men who fought there didn't use words like strategy or doctrine. They used words like mud, fire, silence. They knew that the forest had won, and perhaps it still has. Because today, across new battlefields, artillery once again reigns through trees. Drones replace scouts, coordinates replace compasses, but the echo is the same. The ground trembles, the air screams, the forest listens. History doesn't repeat itself, it just changes uniforms. When the wind moves through the pines of Herken today, it carries a faint metallic hiss, the sound of memory. Maybe it's the wind, or maybe it's the war breathing in its sleep.